Hi everyone, and welcome to another series of our Hizmet Studies Book Club. I've lost count of how many we've done so far, but thank you again for being with us, and hopefully you enjoyed, to those who did, reading the book that we read this month. It's important for me in the sense that when I was reading it, I kind of realized we were at a critical juncture in terms of when the book was written and the research that was done. And then the later stages, of course, in the next few years after the publication of the book, the course that the movement then went through. And I know that the questions that came from those that had read the book, which I tried to feed into our discussion today, were kind of similar in that pattern. So thank you once again for those who did read and participate, and I hope there'll be some fruit from that, and we'll see that in the discussion today. So I started with, welcome and good evening to those who are here in London, and good afternoon to those who are watching from the US. We have a very special guest with us today, Dr. Yu Bao, who's a specialist in organizational sociology and sociology of religion, which I think you could argue are the two most needed specialities when studying the Gülen movement or Hizmet movement. She studied interfaith coalitions and the provisions of social services, and of course has published a book on the Gülen movement, which we've read and are here to discuss today. The Gülen movement, a sociological analysis of a civic movement rooted in moderate Islam, which of course, Professor, you touch upon how certain elements of that title may be problematic, which hopefully we can come to discuss as well. A very warm welcome. Thank you for accepting our invitation. We're honored to have you here virtually, at least. Just to kind of start off, you structure the book around three key theories, two theories, with the kind of aim to explain how those members or volunteers of the movements are motivated, and you use organizational commitment kind of theories in there, and then how the movement is funded, which is probably two kind of large question marks on the movement for those who study. When you look at kind of transnationally how large and wide its activities were, and to some extent do continue despite the kind of repression of the movement. And of course, there you use resource mobilization theory. If you were kind of to summarize your book in kind of a few sentences, how would you summarize the kind of content of the book? And then we have some questions about the research process itself, and then perhaps how you would link it to the position the movement finds itself in today.
Thank you very much for having me here. It's a pleasure. Let me begin by just reminding everyone that the book was published in 2010. So it's about 12 years ago since I collected my data. And so, of course, it doesn't take into account all the many events that have happened in the past decade. But the book as it stands is basically an attempt to analyze the Gülen movement from a sociological perspective. And as you know, I'm using these two theories, research mobilization theory and commitment theory, to try to understand the movement. I want to make it very clear that I never met Mr. Gülen, and probably never will. And the reason for that was very deliberate. I had many opportunities to meet him, but I wanted to keep this book very objective. I wanted to look at it as an outsider. And I was nervous that if I met with Mr. Gülen, especially if photos would leak out or whatever, my readers might think that I'm just promoting the Gülen movement, or I'm just trying to support the movement. And that's not the intention of the book at all. I tried to keep it as objective as possible. And I understand that not too long ago, Mr. Gülen agreed that that was probably the best way to look at the movement. which I was very happy to hear. So I started the book really with money in mind, in the sense that when I first went to Turkey and saw the schools and the hospitals, I first saw Sema Hospital. My husband was with me, and he's a doctor. And he kept saying, some of this is better equipment than we have at the Texas Medical Center. So the question was, who's financing it? And of course, at that time, there was a lot of speculation that it was the Saudis. All kind of speculation was going on. And so that's kind of was my entree into the movement. I wanted to trace the resources. I wanted to see who was really financing the movement. So that's really how it all started. When I submitted my first draft to Cambridge University Press, Harvard University Press, Oxford, they all said the same thing. Who is this fellow? We need something on Mr. Gülen and the movement itself before we talk about such specifics. So I came back to my office and wrote this book, which basically is an introduction, especially for the Western world, of this movement. So that's kind of an overview of what my intentions were and what I had in mind.
I mean, you kind of touched upon the time in which you were writing as well. That the book is over a decade old at the moment, and it kind of follows the post 9/11 tragedy, and there's a lot of question marks, and you kind of mentioned this in your book as well about what Islam is. Why did you think it was important to write on the Gülen movement? Was it kind of solely to understand the kind of financing that you said, or were there kind of, and especially with the chapters where you try to kind of explore Gülen himself and the kind of his philosophy, perhaps theology as well? Do you think that the kind of context in which you were writing had an impact on that as well?
I thought at the time that it was important to, since there were many critics of the movement, as you well know, and at the end of my book I talk about some of those criticisms. So I wanted to present the movement as objectively as I could, mainly in response to some of those criticisms, and because it's a very intriguing movement. And I teach social movements, so looking at it as a social movement I thought was very interesting. So and let me just mention that I have not kept up in a scholarly way with what's happened to the movement. I get a lot of calls from the media wanting me to appear on talk shows and whatever on what's going on with the Gülen movement currently. And I have refused to do any of that because, as I point out, I'm not up to date on the latest goings on in the movement. So if I wrote the book today, it would probably be it would have to be a very different book.
I mean, of course, I mean, especially in the sense of both financing of the movement and the organizational commitment sector. I mean, both sides would be, I guess, perhaps totally different picture, especially as, any kind of things that those kind of hospitals or universities or institutions that you saw in Turkey no longer exist either. So
exactly.
Like you say, it would be a very different portrait of the movement. In your introduction, you kind of mention or thank your daughter Sarah for kind of challenging you in the final chapter of your book, which kind of deals with challenges of the movement. if you were to perhaps write the book, and you mentioned, you know, there were a lot of critics of the movement at the time when you were writing, and I doubt that portrait has changed much, and the same thing can be said, I guess, for the movement today. Do you agree? I mean, do you mind firstly sharing with us, you know, any challenges that you faced, and how you dealt with those when conducting your research, or perhaps in the write-up process?
Mm-hmm. Well, initially, it was a matter of contacts. And if it hadn't been for Alp Aslandoğan, the book probably wouldn't exist, because he actually went with us to Turkey. And the whole purpose was to interview some of these businessmen who were financing the movement at the time. And I have an interesting story about that, because typical of the Gülen people at that time, everything was at the last minute. And so we got to Turkey. My husband was with me, and no interviews had been set up, although I had been very explicit whom I wanted to interview. And Alp said, don't worry about it. And we were invited to a beautiful home on the Bosphorus on Saturday night. And Alp had gotten together some of these big financiers of the movement, elderly men who owned big corporations and whatever, who were supplying a lot of the money behind it. And we got to this home, and started talking. We had dinner, and they said, I'll never forget it. They served that, what do you call it, kufka, or those raw meatballs?
Çiğ köfte.
Yeah, there you go. And they kept wanting me to have some more of that. I finally got through maybe half of one, but that's all I could do. Anyway, they kept eating that, and Alp was my translator. Mm-hmm. And I kept feeding him questions about the movement, and nobody would say too much, especially about finances. What they would always say is, the right hand should not know what the left hand does. So they wouldn't budge on it. And finally, we talked some about the movement, and it was all pretty rosy. And then about 11 o'clock, I thought, this is it. So I said to Alp, I said, this is our last chance. I said, would you ask them how much they contributed to the movement last year? And I think they were getting tired of me and ready to go home. So finally, one of the gentlemen said, look, he said, last year I made, I think he said, over $1 million. And he said, I contributed about 20% to the movement. And that gave me a number. Then I said, is that typical? Or is that way over typical? And then everybody got talking. Well, I gave, 15% last year. And another person said, I divide my income into thirds. A third in the business, a third to my family, and a third to the movement. So then they got to talking. A lot of competition going on. It was wonderful, just great. So I said, if you had a guess, what would you say is the median of all the members in the movement? What would you say is the median that people probably give in a year? And finally, they agreed on about 10%. And that gave me a concrete number, because then I could interview groups and individuals, and I could say, I've been told about 10% is normal. It's the median. And then we could go on from there. So that was a wonderful evening. And in the course of that, I heard a lot of their dreams, and I got a good perspective on why people give like they do. They really believe in the movement. And at the same time, as I argue in my book, this kind of giving has the consequence of commitment. as people give, they feel more committed. It's the old cognitive dissonance theory. If you're giving money and you don't believe in it, you're a fool. So, it's part of the whole commitment mechanisms in the movement. So I don't know if that directly answers your question, but that was a wonderful night.
It went beyond actually, and kind of hearing some of your own experiences as well. I think just enriches the discussion. I mean, I was wondering when you were interviewing them, what were the kind of main reasons which come up? Because of course the movement has kind of several areas, well, three main areas: education, the dialogue, and reduction of poverty or erasing of poverty. Nurses, kind of three ills in society which he kind of tries to tackle, which Gülen himself has kind of adopted and brought forward in the 21st century. In your kind of research, were any of these more prominent, or was it kind of a general, perhaps religious notion that you're seeing, perhaps nationalistic? Because Gülen, of course, especially at that time, the movement was more Turkic from bottom up, and also, the discourses and activities that were being done. Which kind of element or motivator was the one that you came across most frequently?
I don't think you can separate them. Okay. Because, in the course of supporting these institutions and promoting these institutions, it comes from the general Islamic faith. That's why people are doing it. So, I although they talked about supporting these various institutions, it was always in the light of, zakat and kind of what the Prophet emphasized. So it was always with that kind of motivation that they were creating and sustaining these kind of institutions.
I mean, is this something that you've seen in perhaps observations of other Islamic-inspired movements? Or, I mean, does how you observe that with the Gülen movement, does that fit into the kind of general Islamic paradigm, in your opinion, or is there something?
Yes, no, it's so difficult to talk about generalizations in Islam because I've seen the whole gamut. It's difficult. I would say that the thing that impressed me the most about the Gülen movement was it was an attempt, a very deliberate attempt, to practice Islam in the world, to do good out of one's Islamic commitments. And of course, what was so intriguing a decade ago was the fact that it was a moderate Islamic movement. As you well know, Mr. Gülen kept saying, we don't need more madrasas. We need more good schools. We need to educate our youth. And the fact that he established these schools to teach, math and science and technology, as well as, the faith, I think made the movement very unique at that time. And remember, it was about 10 years after 9/11 in the United States. So there was a lot of, hostile attitudes toward Islam, still very much circulating in the population. And that's one of the reasons I introduced the movement to the Western world, was the fact that, here's a movement now that condemns violence and that is a peace-loving movement. And one of the goals is peace. So that was very much a motivation for my reading the book. I wanted to introduce this movement that I had discovered, was so committed to peace. And I was amazed, when I would start my interviews, I would say, well, what about these Islamic terrorists who attacked the United States? And the answer inevitably was, they're not really Muslims.
Mhm.
You can't be a good Muslim and be a terrorist.
Mhm.
So I really wanted to emphasize this peace-loving aspect of the movement.
And perhaps this is kind of a difficult question, but when you kind of observe this peace-loving movement, were there any kind of schools of thought? I mean, did you see people just repeating the discourse of Gülen, or would they kind of give him as an example when discussing this, or was it something that perhaps they'd internalized more and it was kind of like their own internalized vision of what Islam was that they were trying to live out?
Well, let me start backwards. I also interviewed some of the Gülen-inspired people in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And I was amazed at the youth. Some of them really didn't know who Gülen was. They knew nothing about him.
Are these youth from the movement? Sorry. Are these youth who perhaps would attend the movement's schools or kind of extracurricular activities?
Both, really.
Okay.
They were part of the movement, and they liked the, tenets of the movement, and they liked, the community aspects of the movement. But in terms of Mr. Gülen, they just never mentioned him. They just weren't real conscious of him. Now, I thought that was fascinating, because this is like second or third generation
Mm-hmm.
in the movement. And I saw then the great need for just a biography of him. I mean, these kids really didn't know who he was.
Mm-hmm.
So I found myself educating people in the movement who knew less about Mr. Gülen than I did.
I think it's quite typical that a lot of people who kind of cross roads with the movement realize perhaps at a later date that the institution they're perhaps in or with is somewhat inspired by the movement, because I think for perhaps different reasons the organizations don't like to kind of openly say. I mean, and then this is kind of, I guess there are two angles to this. Perhaps it's better in the sense that it may be more inclusive, but of course there's the counter argument that it isn't transparent in the organization and declaring who they are. So is there anything you'd kind of like to comment on that at all?
Well, and I think as the movement spread around the world, which it did, it's very much an international movement. I don't know, there seems to be less and less consciousness of Mr. Gülen. And that's what it is. It's a lack of consciousness. It's not that they question him or against him or whatever. They just don't know much about the origins of the movement. And what they know, of course, like all religion, is what their parents pass on.
Mm-hmm.
But and I think that, of course, I always get this question, and I'm sure it's going to come up. What will happen when Mr. Gülen is no longer here? And my answer to that, especially since I interviewed some of these people in the diaspora, is I don't think it's going to make a whole lot of difference.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we have his writings and his, talks and whatever, but there's so many people now around the world who have caught his spirit, who have rose to leadership positions as such. And, I think since it's not a hierarchical organization, I think these informal leaders will simply start to lead. And I don't think I don't think Mr. Gülen's death is going to be the end of the movement.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And he certainly has not appointed anybody to succeed him. And I don't think he ever would do that if I can read his mind.
Mm-hmm. I just to kind of add, I think from his own internalization or interpretation Islam, and particularly the impact of Sufism on him. I think he restrains from kind of calling himself the leader of the movement in the first place, although those who engage with his work and those who participate in actions and organizations inspired by him do from the consciousness and awareness to different extents that, you know, the movement was inspired and motivated by him. And for many people, his presence is important in kind of them remaining in the movement. But I think it's interesting that you mentioned, you know, that the kind of lack of consciousness of him, and perhaps those who don't have Turkish as their mother tongue, that was perhaps a dynamic I was thinking. Because those from Turkey, perhaps a few decades back, you had the chance to meet Gülen in person and listen to his sermons in person. I mean, and you know, there are kind of a lot of theorizations. You're hearing a man cry from you know, the pulpit of a mosque, which for a lot of people in Turkey, that is something that was never seen before. A man crying, yet alone in a mosque. It's a kind of total change and understanding of what Islam means to a generation now, who a second, third generation perhaps living in the West, who live with the reality of the kind of impact of 9/11 on the Muslim community, and grow up with the kind of perhaps Islamophobia, discrimination, arguing with their own self, you know, am I part of a religion which is genuinely violent? And as, you know, young Muslims growing up, we have to deal with verses in the Quran which are kind of portrayed as being violent and kind of different identity crises that Muslims may have. And then they find a channel in which they can live their religion and also contribute to society and be included in society. So I think that may be an impact. I wasn't actually planning on asking the question, what would happen after Gülen's death? I agree with what you say, that I think that a lot of, I mean, rarely are decisions made by him, and I assume very, very rarely in kind of native countries are any decisions made by him. So I like you, I believe that the majority, the Muslim, the Hizmet movement would continue as it is. But I guess time will show, and we'll just wait to see. Just to kind of look over some of the questions that our readers have sent in. Quite.
Well, while you're looking at those questions, can I make one comment?
Of course, of course.
And I get a lot of disagreement with this, and it's simply my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like calling this the Hizmet movement.
Okay.
I really don't. I think it's the Gülen movement. And the reason I know Mr. Gülen doesn't want to call attention to himself,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't think even just using that name calls attention to him. I mean, it's just so much in common parlance. It's the Gülen movement. And when I hear talks at professional meetings and whatever, you don't hear Hizmet very much. You hear the Gülen movement, and then people know who you're talking about. So that's just a tiny issue. But
yeah,
anyway.
I mean, I'm stuck in the middle with that. I mean, I recently wrote and still to complete my MA thesis, which touches upon the movement as well. I use the Gülen movement throughout it. But in professional settings, I mean, I'm unsure if I should, when I try to look at it academically, I mean, I try to look at it as me outside the movement, so I'm never placing myself in it, although I know that is a reality as well, and probably does somehow structure or direct my thinking and analysis. What is important for me is, or the question that I have is should I be defining it as members of the movement defining it, and am I studying it from perhaps their perspective, or should I define it as the Gülen movement? But I find defining it as the Gülen movement more comfortable for someone who's writing on the movement. Perhaps the situation in which we're discussing the movement itself kind of impacts that, but it's definitely a discussed topic. And of course, in Turkey, the movement is referred to as just the Fethullahist terrorist organization at the moment. So neither Gülen or Hizmet is left in the rhetoric anymore. But yeah, I mean, I think from my observations, at least of Muslims in the West, they would refrain from using Gülen because they don't want to. The Islamic origins of the movement, I think, in second and third generations, although it's still present, they refrain from it, especially in European context where society is more secular. They would rather be a service movement who are, you know, providing to society, but not necessarily from just a mere Islamic perspective. Although, of course, Gülen's theology incorporates service into Islamic discourse. So perhaps it's like a seesaw trying to keep the balance. Just one of the questions, and it's a provocative question, perhaps. In your mind, did you have any change of thought about the Hizmet movement or Fethullah Gülen post 2016?
Did I have any? What's the question?
Change of thought about the movement or Gülen himself post 2016.
You mean have any change of thought since I've written the book or while I was researching the book?
2016, so post the attempted coup.
You know, as I say, I don't know what to think of the movement. I mean, all the nuances of the movement since I collected my data, because all I really know about it is the media and personally friends I have in the movement. I haven't changed my mind about the movement, but at the same time, I can't say much about it because I don't know all the nuances, you know, behind what's happened in the last decade. It needs to be studied and it needs to be written up. But, you know, I have not been the one to do that. So, no, I mean, I haven't changed my idea. I think these Gülen movement people are wonderful. And I think they have shown their greatness in how they've responded, at least in the United States, to what's happened in the past decade. I'm just amazed, you know, how many people have taken in family and relatives and might be supporting 2 or 3 families. The person who's, you know, the bread earner in the family. So I think it's wonderful. And things are changing. I hope somebody's going to ask the question about women.
Actually, one of my dear friends had, it wasn't on my list of questions from readers, but I'm also kind of looking at questions that are coming in from YouTube, and I'm sure one of my friends I've just realized has asked, what do you think about women's rights or existence in terms of actions in the Gülen movement? Is her question. Well, so she's touched on. I'll raise the question to the top of my list, and you can feel free to answer.
Well, let me speak mainly from what I observe in Houston. When I first knew this movement in Houston, in the good old days, when they would put on these big luncheons and have, you know, 500 people there, you never saw a woman at the podium. It was totally male-centered. And I was on one of the original boards of the Dialogue Society here in Houston. And we'd go to a board meeting at the, you know, Turquoise Center, and they would serve a wonderful meal, but you'd never see who prepared the meal. It was the women. They'd bring it to the door, and some man would go to the door, pick it up, and serve it. I wanted to see these women. When we had a woman or two finally, at my insistence, on the board, they would sit off by themselves and they wouldn't speak. And I used to complain about this all the time. I think my dear Gülen friends got tired of me. I kept saying, I want to see the day when there's a veiled woman up there at the podium as MC. And finally, they brought some beautiful woman from one of the TV stations. And as I said to Alp, that doesn't count. That's not one of your own. Well, I just want to tell you that today, the latest events I've gone to, it's women up there running the show. I think it's wonderful. And I think the women have really come forward. Of course, I think a lot of it is language.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they've learned in this country, they've learned English, and that's given them a lot of confidence. And some other women, you know, have gone into professions that they didn't when they first came to this country or couldn't.
Mm-hmm.
I have a very good friend. Some of you probably know her. She was a physician in Turkey, and she's now a hospital chaplain and very well regarded. So I've seen a real change. And I have to tell my story. I was giving a lecture on the book, and at the end of the lecture, two veiled high school girls came up and they whispered in my ear, Dr. Eba, when we grow up, we want to be just like you. Now, I think what they were saying is, we want to have the confidence to be able to stand up, talk in public. And I said, look, the day is going to come. Just hang in there. It's coming. So there's been a real change, I think, in the role of women in the movement. And I'm delighted to see it.
I mean, I've, you know, seen articles written about the women of the movement in kind of parallel to what you've just described on perhaps a few years back of how the women were kind of motivated and perhaps acted within the movement. But I think, and I hope no one from the movement here in London takes offense to this, but London had a very similar pattern to what you had in Houston, and I'm sure a lot of cities across the world also did. But I mean, to talk on behalf of our dialogue organization here, the Dialogue Society, and a lot of people would kind of give testament to this, that it is our female volunteers who really run the show on the ground level, and they are our greatest asset, I think, of both our organization and the Hizmet movement. And Gülen himself has mentioned that you know, especially during the post 2016 times, it really was the women who I think perhaps felt responsibility to kind of take charge and continue things where perhaps things are a little shaken. And I think this is a pattern we've seen, and I think it will continue. On behalf of our organization here, I mean, we take a lot of interns in and kind of try to provide some sort of structured internship opportunities for them in our dialogue organization. And it's women or female, young kind of female high school students who always apply and come, and we're ever so grateful to have them. So now I have to go to meetings and ask for male students to come because they're lacking in participation. So it's definitely, the roles are reversed, and hopefully, you know, it will come together in the future. I'll just have a look over some questions. One of the questions is does Professor Helen know of any similar movements from sociological perspectives in the world and perhaps throughout history?
Now, wait, I missed that question. Slow down and
sorry.
Let me hear it. It sounds interesting. I don't want to miss it.
Does Professor Helen know of any similar movements from either sociological perspectives in the world and through history? Are there any?
I still didn't get the question.
Are there any?
Me one more time.
Okay. Are there any similar movements from sociological perspectives in the world or from history that remind you?
Well, not just like it, because all movements are unique, but sure there are. I mean, all you have to do is look at some of the Catholic orders, like the Franciscans, like the Jesuits. I mean, in some ways that's comparable, you know, in terms of wanting to do good works and serve people. So, yeah, I think there are other movements. I think there are a lot of other movements. And in fact, I think each faith group has such movements. Now, they're all different. No two movements are alike. But in terms of, especially of doing good works that come out of their basic theology and lived experience, I think is common for these groups. What's unique about I don't know about unique, but it certainly was unique at the time I did my research, is this moderate Islam, this wanting to live Islam sort of in the world in a good sense by combining one's ideology and theology with doing good works for people. I've often thought it would be very interesting to do a comparative study of the Gülen movement with other Islamic groups. I haven't seen anybody do that systematically, but I think it would be very interesting. Another interesting point, I once asked at an international conference, why is it that in my experience, so often members of the Gülen movement do not interact with other Islamic groups? And somebody from Houston responded and they said, you know, the police have, and the FBI have warned us that there are Islamic groups in Houston that are suspicious, that are on FBI lists, and warned us not to be seen around those, around those places where they gather, because it would put a smear or suspicions on people in the movement.
I mean, an argument that I've had before, but I think it's a pattern that's repeated with the movement throughout at least the Western world. Not so much a pattern in kind of Africa, I think, where I know that, you know, even the movement has kind of non-Turkish Islamic scholars participating in kind of the Islamic knowledge production through the Islamic schools and kind of institutes in Africa. In places like Egypt, for example. But I kind of wonder if it's a trauma that the movement has brought forward from Turkey, where in Turkey there were no kind of real friendly Muslim allies of the movement, and you know, perhaps today's portrayal kind of shows that. And there's always a suspicion of the other. There's always someone trying to infiltrate your organization, or kind of these Islamist notions, which I don't think are actually that prominent in Turkey. But there's always this lived suspicion and kind of trauma of suspicion that I think the movement most likely carried forward in the West. And in the West, I think that's probably, I mean, I know it's something that's trying to be broken. It's a pattern that's trying to be broken, especially as the movement realized that during the crackdown of the movement in Turkey, they had no real, perhaps sustainable Muslim allies who could say, wait a second, this is all wrong, you know, that these violations shouldn't be occurring. And perhaps it's sad that the movement had to learn this through lived realities. But it's definitely a question mark. And on kind of the comment of a comparative study, I mean, I'm aware of some, but I don't think it's from an organizational end. I think it's more of, you know, just comparing people like Tariq Ramadan with Gülen on kind of concepts like Darul Harb, for example. I don't think it's I haven't come across such studies, so it would definitely be interesting. I think people of the movement may be wary of conducting such a study because it sounds a little provocative, kind of from, you know, comparing an Islamic movement. And you mentioned the term kind of moderate Islam, which, I mean, I don't know if in the US if movement members kind of use the term, but I know in Europe they're kind of a little wary. And for Gülen, it is Islam. And you mentioned, you know, what perhaps a Westerner would call moderate Islam is for Gülen. It is what the essence of Islam is. So it's nice to kind of have and be able to touch upon these nuances. I'm just looking at.
I think, you know, I started to do this and just never really followed through with it as systematically as I would have liked. And that is, the movement really now needs to be studied in the diaspora.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think more than anything, that's what's going to change the movement. questions like, will it stay so Turkish? How much will it open up to non-Turkish folk? Who's welcome in these samats, these local circles? How can it open up to non-Turkish people?
I guess the first answer would be changing the language of the Sohbet itself to the language of the country you're in. I think that would be the kind of first step forward. But I'm not sure if you'd met Paul Weller, Professor Paul Weller, here from the UK. He's got a book which should be coming out, I believe, in March next year, on some kind of new trends in the movement. But it is focused on a European aspect, and is definitely something that, I mean, other than the upcoming book, which I know about, that I'm not familiar, that has been studied or is kind of being studied. But I mean, I'd love to look at, the kind of preliminary research or kind of findings that you had, or questions that you have as well. I'm just
if somebody wants a good dissertation topic, there's one. Because this notion of movements spreading around the world, this notion of the diaspora is a very interesting one. And one could look at that very sociologically. So I'm suggesting this as a seed for people who need a dissertation topic.
My dissertation is kind of focused on the topic of transnational repression itself, so how dictators act outside their state borders. But there are a couple of concepts that I take into hand, which I try to analyze sociologically. So the concept of gurbet, for example, for Gülen, living away from your home, and kind of how this is ingrained in the Turkish psyche, and then how it plays out in kind of the actions of those in the movement. And then I oddly try to link it with the past 10 years in Turkish history, and how it came to resulting to what the movement's in today. So I kind of touch upon briefly on some things that you've mentioned, but it's a lot of depth, and mine was just a master's dissertation. So hopefully someone will kind of pick up your topic. I know I've got a few friends watching, so I'm kind of hoping one of them pick up the topic and continue through with that. I mean, I'm looking at one of the questions. It's kind of what we're talking about at the moment. If you would write a research about Gülen and his movement, what areas would you be focusing on now? So if you were to write,
I'd be focused on the diaspora, because I think that's where the movement is now. I'd be focused on how the movement sustains itself once it leaves that Turkish context. I'd be interested in how you generate commitment. A lot of the movement in Turkey was very nationalistic. I mean, very Turkish oriented. What happens to the movement when it moves out of the Turkish culture and it moves across the world? So that's where I personally would be focused. That, and of course, this comparative issue. How does the movement, how is it alike? How is it different from other social movements?
I mean, definitely the generational commitment thing. Again, my own observations. I think the Turkishness is obviously, or the nationalistic element of it is kind of eroding. And I joke a lot with my friends at times that, I mean, I'm not ethnically Turkish, so I joke around with them. Sometimes they make comments on in a friendly way about their superiority, and then I say, am I excluded from this because I'm not Turkish? And we can have that kind of discussion and fun amongst ourselves. And I think in a genuine commitment, I mean, maybe it's a generational thing. When we look at patterns of youth in Turkey as well, that nationalistic or element isn't passed around to perhaps my generation in Turkey as well as much as it was before. Perhaps it's an element of globalization, of Turkey not doing so well at the moment, both economically and people looking outwards and realizing that the kind of Turkey that they were taught in schools perhaps doesn't really exist. But yeah, it's an interesting dynamic itself.
You know, let me make a comment on this intergenerational issue.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I study the new immigrants. Almost every group is facing this issue. How do you maintain the culture of your group when you move to second and third generation? And the big issue that goes across these immigrant groups is the youth aren't showing up, you know, for formal activities. There's a Hindu mosque, a Hindu temple I was in not too long ago that started serving hot dogs and pizza after their services to try to draw the young people. This seems to be a trend. So I think, you know, looking at this intergenerational thing is very important, not only for the movement, but across movements and religious groups.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I mean, we've got 2 minutes to end, so I would kind of like to leave it on that question mark. Perhaps and leave it on, I mean, in terms of the future of the movement as well, and whether it can pass its values, activities, and commitment, as you said, which is the main motivator of the movement, and it's the kind of perhaps at times selflessness of some of its volunteers, which got it far as it was in Turkey, and perhaps time will show whether that will continue in. Thank you so much, Professor, for being here with us. I've took my notes and have a few things to follow up on email. I really enjoyed our discussion, and hopefully we can see you at future events as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'll leave you now to your discussions.
Thank you. Thanks.